We are today here for a panel to discuss a very important topic which isn't often discussed, and that is child sex abuse. Now, I just want to give people a chance to know that some of the things we will be talking about might be quite distressing, so I just want to give you a content warning and to let you know that if at any point you feel uncomfortable, then please do feel free to leave or exit the live streaming. Now, this conference today is a collaboration between Imam, the Khoei Foundation and Urban Muslims. For those of you that don't know, Imam is the Mosque and Imam's National Advisory Board. It is an advisory and facilitatory body for good governance in mosques and for improving the performance of Imams and Islamic teachers through a process of self-regulation based on agreed standards. They do a lot of good work. Khoei Islamic Centre is an international charitable voluntary organisation founded in 1989 to look after the welfare and cater for the needs of Muslim communities around the globe, and I'm sure they don't really need an introduction from me. Urban Muslims is an online platform which provides a space for conversation around faith, politics and social issues surrounding the Muslim community. Please go and check them out online. My name is Ahmed. I am the founder of She Speaks We Hear, an online platform for women. I just want to say a big thank you and welcome to our esteemed panelists. We are very lucky today. We have people who are experts and who have many years of experience in dealing with these issues and how to safeguard our community. So I'd like to start with our first speaker, Nazir Afzal, who I think probably is very well known and doesn't need an introduction, but Nazir Afzal, OBE, is a British solicitor. He has experience in the legal areas of child sexual exploitation and violence against women. He's a former Chief Crown Prosecutor for North West England, and he will be speaking to us online. Over to you, Nazir.
Struggling to hear you. Can you hear me? That's more.
Can you hear us?
I'm looking for someone to say you can hear me.
We can hear. Okay, just give us a moment.
Just wave if you can hear me. Yes, you're waving. Excellent. You can hear me. That's all that matters. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Very sorry that I can't join you in person. I apologize for this ridiculous gear that I've got on me. But I am here and I am very keen to share with you some thoughts I have on the issue of child sexual abuse. And it's an issue, of course, that's very close to my heart, one that I have led on for the Crown Prosecution Service when I was a Chief Prosecutor, and in more recent years I have maintained and campaigned on these matters. As some of you will know, I'm out since the summer. I have also been the chair of the Catholic Church's safeguarding agency, which is an independent safeguarding agency that they have created, which is meant to hold the church to account. And it's very brave of them to outsource the inspection of their safeguarding regimes, particularly to a Muslim, rather than to a Catholic. And I think that says something about their commitment to tackling this issue. Now, specifically in relation to why it's important, I have to say this. Most child sexual abuse remains hidden. There is no institution, there is no body, nowhere on earth, actually, which is safe for children in the ways that we would expect children to feel safe. There is a significant time lag between it happening and it being reported. You will appreciate that children, when they are being abused by people who are more powerful than them. And as a consequence, they don't feel able to speak up because of repercussions and victimization. And that's why it's essential that we don't simply think, well, it happened a few months or years ago, therefore it's not important. Of course it's important. And we have to understand why it is that people take such a long time to report these terrible crimes. There is massive inconsistency in reporting and recording. Some people are very good at it. If you don't look, I always say this, if you don't look, you will not find. That's why if anybody turns around to you and says, oh, it doesn't happen in our mosque or in our community, they are deluded, they're blind, and they're not doing any favors to the children that they have in their care. It happens everywhere, and that's the saddest thing, and it remains something that we all ought to be aware of. Building trust takes leadership, it takes resourcing, both the things that Minab and others need to recognize, that it starts with you recognizing, as you have done today, how important the subject is. It's not about whether it's an uncomfortable conversation, it's a conversation you must have. And it goes back a long time. I remember in the early 2000s, the organization that was then called the Muslim Parliament produced a report. Dr. Siddiqui produced a report on abuse within Islamic settings, in effect. And it talked then about sexual abuse that might be happening. And I remember the reaction to it from too many people in our communities was that he has some kind of agenda or that it's not true. But actually, that report was far-sighted. It was way ahead of what the UK government and other UK institutions did to understand what was happening. So we had an opportunity 15, 16 years ago to be ahead of the game, and we're now 15, 16 years behind. I think in early 2013 by the Muslim Women's Network, which interviewed a large number of women victims who were abused as children. Again, you may have seen that. If you haven't seen that, you need to see that, because it will tell you the journey that those victims have been on. They are survivors now. They were unheard, believed, they weren't being listened to, and as a consequence, it is our great shame that no justice was done and that they suffered. It also needs to be said, actually, that the lifelong trauma results. A lot of people say, you know, time is a healer, etc. It's not a healer. It's not. I've come across cases where people are self-harming well into their 60s and 70s because of abuse they received when they were teenagers or even younger. So this is not something that passes. People will be victims for a long, long time, and you need to recognize and respond accordingly. I think I've said already that we underestimate the scale of it. I said already that professional curiosity, the professional inability to look and find is a concern for me. You need to train people to be able to do that. I've also said that we failed to put the child at the center of our response. You know, if a child tells you they've been abused, or even if they don't, and you can sense it, and you get a disclosure from them, you've got to act upon it. Covering up does nobody any favors, and in fact, it's absolutely un-Islamic to do so. There's a failure of multi-agency working, which means that we don't refer appropriately when we need support or the victim needs support. You have to forgive me, but there is now somebody outside doing some gardening, but this is the perils of home working. There is something to be said also about the lack of action in disrupting perpetrators. If we do not bring them to account, they feel able to carry on. Let me make this abundantly clear to you. A sexual predator does not just have one victim. They will have many victims. And unless we stop them, they will carry on. And very often, again, because of the nature of this type of behavior, they will seek a type of employment that gives them access to children. So they may well be madrasa teachers or working in schools or that kind of environment, because that's what they do. That's what predators do. And so we need to do a great deal more about disrupting predators, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we stop that in due course. We also don't share information very well, and so whereas you might have, or somebody might have a concern, um, and they don't tell somebody else, and the reality is that your piece of the jigsaw added to somebody else's piece of the jigsaw ultimately gives you the bigger picture. And we need to have information sharing protocols in place that enable that to happen. One of the differences undoubtedly between the Catholic Church, the work I'm doing with the Catholic Church, and the work that Minab or the Muslim communities will do, is that we're not hierarchical in the way that the church is. So um, if the bishops and the cardinals say that this needs to happen, then it will happen. We don't necessarily have that, but let's learn from what other agencies and organizations do. So one thing they do is that they have safeguarding leads everywhere. So every diocese, every church, everywhere children are and vulnerable people will be, you will find a safeguarding lead. And that's their responsibility. More than anything else, that's their responsibility. And they will be properly trained, and they will have escalation processes which enable them to seek guidance and help and report as necessary. So we have to understand that structurally we're nowhere near there. Some of our mosques and community centers, etc., will probably have something similar, but that is nothing like as robust and as consistent as it needs to be. So we could do that. The other thing that the church does, which they now do, I implemented it, is standards. So there are 8 standards. If you look on the CSSA, Catholic Church Safeguarding Standards Agency website, which came out a couple of months ago, you will see 8 standards that every body working in the church has to comply with, and they are very clear. And again, it's something that MENA perhaps and the communities, Muslim communities, can develop, which will then be consistent. And ultimately, the reason that the standards exist is that we expect compliance, and that means that they'll be audited. Do we have an organization? Is MENA the right place? Do we have an organization that will inspect and audit performance against safeguarding standards? Well, we don't, and we need it. And that is one thing I think structurally we can do. We have to stop victim blaming, and this is across the piece. Somehow victims are in some way responsible for what happened to them. That's just an utter nonsense. And I've come across this many times when I prosecute when I used to prosecute, say, I don't know, a senior member of our communities. I would get other members of our communities writing letters saying it's not his fault, he didn't do it. The victims came on to him, the 9-10-year-olds, by the way, came on to him, and they were, what can I say? It's disgusting, it's un-Islamic, it's rubbish, and we have to ensure that we don't blame victims. We hold perpetrators to account, and we don't, forgive it or excuse it. This behavior is just something that's unacceptable. And linked to that is the fact that it's everybody's business. I mentioned earlier on that every institution needs to have some kind of safeguarding lead, but it should be everybody's business. So everybody that goes into a mosque, everybody that goes to a madrasa, everybody that comes into contact with our communities and with our children needs to see it as their business. So if they become aware of somebody that's likely to harm, or somebody that has harmed, or somebody that could be harmed, they need to be able to have a process by which they can, potentially the police, firstly the police, in my view, if it's a criminal matter, but there has to be a requirement that anybody and everybody sees it as their business. Safeguarding is everybody's business, and unless that is put in place, we will be just tinkering and not fixing it. And training is key here, and this is where survivors come in. The best training in any environment that I have found has been delivered by survivors. When you sit and listen to the journey of somebody who has experienced harm, and the obstacles that were placed in their way, and how they were unbelieved and how they were not supported, I can assure you that you will learn from them. I've always learned from them, that you will understand that your response needs to improve. So training being delivered potentially by survivors, but at the very least, it has to be delivered and it has to reach a standard. There is a number of people, a number of organizations in this world, I'm afraid, who are only in it for the money. And they will deliver training for you because they think they'll be paid for it, and they will be paid for it. And I don't. I mean, I'm not going to name and shame them. My point is that you need to evaluate the training that's being delivered. You need to understand the impact that it's had on the people who the training has been received by, in order for you to recognize that it's doing what it needs to do. Any strategy that MINAB or any organization anywhere in the world that develops, that uses the phrases women must, women should, children must, children should, is a failure, because they do not ask to be abused. A strategy must start with the perpetrators must, the men must, men should. Invariably, unfortunately, men are the perpetrators here. Very few female perpetrators in my experience. And therefore, we need to confront toxic masculinity. We need to confront people, men who have a sense of entitlement and who feel that they can act with impunity without any consequences. And so whatever strategy you come up with must focus on the perpetrator or potential perpetrator rather than the potential victim. Other than, when it comes to victims, ensuring that they're properly supported and that they are guided and helped, and ultimately justice is delivered. As I said, child sexual abuse happens everywhere. Abusers exist everywhere. Abusers often spend their whole lives trying to find ways of being able to abuse. When I prosecuted the various grooming gangs, the media always focused on the British Pakistani or British Muslim perpetrators and the British white girls. They never focused on the British Muslim girls that I also found were being abused. In the most famous case, the Rochdale grooming gang case, again, people you will probably think, hang on a minute, these 9 men abused all these white girls. What you'll forget is I then prosecuted the ringleader, the main man, immediately after that trial for his abuse of a Pakistani girl, British Asian girl. So they are victims too. They just don't get the publicity, and they have additional barriers. The additional barriers of honor is that the family will not support them. The family will blame them. The communities will blame them. The communities will stand by these powerful individuals and somehow suggest that they have got it wrong. And, we've got to stand up for them. We've got to support them. And we've got to ensure that powerful men who are perpetrators are not allowed to have access to children or to abuse, and then are ultimately brought to justice where it's possible to do so, where the evidence is there. And we are a very diverse communities. In London, the Muslim communities come from, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 countries. In the north of England, the Muslim community, in London, they come from 50 or 60 countries. In the north of England, Muslims tend to come from 2 or 3 countries. And so we're less diverse in that sense. But the issues remain the same regardless of where you are. That children are not believed, that children are not properly supported, the perpetrators feel able to do what they can, that the groups around the perpetrators will somehow excuse them, somehow support them. And it disgusts me, quite frankly, that in 2021, we are still so far behind other faiths and other institutions who made massive progress in tackling this issue. Nobody's out of the woods. There are abuse today everywhere. But we as a community and communities, I think, have a long way to go. And we could have been so far ahead if we listened to the Muslim Parliament research back 16 years ago. So ensure that we have proper safeguarding in place. Ensure that leaders don't say this is an uncomfortable conversation. It is the necessary conversation. Ensure that children have referral pathways. They know who to turn to when they are in danger and when they're at risk. Ensure that you risk assess and risk manage these cases and the people who might be responsible. Ensure that you support the victims, um, and believe them. Do not ever say to a victim, "I don't believe you. You weren't there." Your job is to investigate, to make sure that the authorities investigate, and that's the next thing. If you were a burglary victim and you went to a police station and said, "I've been burgled," how would you feel if a police officer said to you, "I don't believe you've been burgled"? The police job is then to investigate whether or not a burglary took place and who's responsible. And the same thing applies even more so to sexual abuse, where sadly there's so much skepticism and so much negativity that we don't believe victims when they are suffering. And you know, when the Catholic Church, the French Catholic Church, did a report looking back 50 years, and it's published about a month ago, and they found thousands, thousands of pedophiles working in the Catholic Church. They found tens of thousands of victims who had either reported or had failed to do so. Let me be absolutely blunt. We as a community are nowhere near different from that. We will have thousands of perpetrators who claim to be Muslims. We will have tens of thousands of victims. And we have a handful of cases that are brought to court because we put barriers in the way and we do not respect, we do not deal with these cases as effectively as we should. So what's the role of MENA? Well, MENA and our institutions have to show leadership here. And that means this conversation should be the first of weekly, monthly conversations. One sermon on a Friday once a year or once every 2 years is not good enough. This is something that impacts on pretty much every family or families. Again, I'll make another reference to another faith, the Sikh community. Sikh Women's Aid published their report last week and found that the abuse within the Sikh community was of industrial levels. It happens everywhere. And the fact that we have so few prosecutions, so few cases brought, so few brought to the attention of the public and the wider community tells me we've got a long, long way to go. Thank you very much indeed. I can hear you. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. 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 I have my views, and I have published them a few times, and I've written about them a few times. But my point is, and I say this to the UK government, and I say this to perhaps we need some research. I don't want to base it on the hundreds of cases I've dealt with. I want to base it on the tens of thousands of cases that happen, so we can have some proper research. But why? There are a number of reasons that come to mind. One, I think our relationship education is poor. So many of our many men have never been educated in what their responsibilities are as a man. Whether you want to call it sexuality education or relationship education. I remember a Glasgow Imam said that he was going to organize sexuality education or sex education, and everybody just laughed at him. But then he did it again and said, I'm doing some respect education because I want men to respect women and girls. I want men to respect children. And that was much more effective. But we need to mandate it. We need in our education systems, in our schools, in our madrasas, to have conversations about respect. Many of the men that I've prosecuted had zero respect for women and girls. And was that because of the way they've been brought up? Perhaps. Was it because they weren't properly educated? Well, if you don't know what an abusive relationship is, and if you don't know how to treat women, well, I thought the Quran tells you how to treat women, but unfortunately, some men have found their own way. They learn about sex from other men. and that means that they learn the wrong way and the wrong thinking. So I think education is a part of that, and relationship education is a part of that. I think that culturally there's some issues. You know, can I share with you something, which comes from some of the perpetrators I've spoken to after they've been convicted? One or two of them were opened up to me. One man in particular said to me, Nazir, at the age of 16, I was had an arranged marriage, and and this was the only woman I've ever known, and the only woman that literally that I've ever slept with or had any relationship with whatsoever, ever. I never got any sexuality or relationship education beforehand, and suddenly, and I was expected to have children. There was expectations, etc. And this is my life, and so they end up straying. And then they end up talking to other men who are abusive, and they become abusers. Some of the abusers that I've dealt with were groomed by other abusers to become abusers. And so there's some cultural issues around arranged marriage, forced marriage, of course. But I think the main cause is that we have a real problem with our education system, and why it is that
basically to
100%,
yeah.
100%. If we don't teach people what a good relationship is and how to respect each other, well, how else are they going to learn?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to the audience that are here in the centre and see if anybody's got a question from the audience.
I think just building on the education thing, ultimately we're all humans and we have a heart and we should know what's right or wrong, regardless of the level of education we've had. Sorry, did you catch the beginning of that?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Yeah. I suppose what I'd query is that regardless of education, a person can be illiterate and still know that sexual abuse is wrong. How much would you perceive that shame and the culture of shame impacts the dynamics that lead to perpetrators abusing?
Could we just take the other question as well, Nazir, before you answer that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. The other question is regarding safeguarding. So how do you raise the culture of safeguarding amongst the community on a practical level?
Okay, all right. In terms of the first question, I'm trying to understand what you mean by that. Do you mean the shame that the men feel, or do you mean shame generally as an izzat and honor?
No, I mean across the piece, the shame that leads to people not being able to talk about these things openly, the shame that leads to taboo around classes about sexuality and what it is to be a man, and the shame that stops people from talking, the whole shroud that it allows for.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I speak only about myself, but I suspect the other men in this room will probably feel very similar, is that I never learned anything about sex growing up. I learned it from other men telling me what it was like or whatever it was, or from reading. And these days it's even worse now. They can find out tons of rubbish online, can't they? And unless that vacuum will be filled. And so I think that's a problem for me. That vacuum exists and it's being filmed. They're ashamed that they don't know anything about relationships. Well, the issue of izzat and shame has been a problem for me because it always had this additional barrier that victims from our communities face, and to some extent perpetrators face, is that we don't want to talk about it. We pretend we brush it under the carpet. We pretend it's not happening, rather than actually confronting the issue. And of course, we're doing ourselves no favors at all by doing that. But yeah, absolutely. I think every victim from our communities that I've dealt with has told me that they felt ashamed about talking about this. But why shouldn't they? Because I can point to cases, forgive me, where the victim was told to either get married to their perpetrator, which has happened on occasions, or on other occasions told, if you don't shut up, you will face consequences. You've dishonored us. You've dishonored us by being the victim. Well, we've got a massive, massive problem. And it links to the second question about embedding safeguarding. Safeguarding is a very complicated word, but it shouldn't be. It's about protecting our most vulnerable. And who is more vulnerable than children? And I think if you spoke to a parent anywhere, or anybody that's got access to children or knows children, and you said to them, what is the most important thing in relation to a child? And they'll say, to protect that child. to ensure that child isn't harmed in any way, shape, or form. That's the messaging. We need to make it. We need to simplify it. And I remember after Rochdale, I did a town hall event where I was talking to hundreds of members of our communities, and I said, look, my point earlier on about being everybody's business. Somebody here must have known something was going on and didn't tell anybody. It must come be no surprise a 59-year-old man was driving around a 14-year-old white girl all the time. You might have thought something's not working here. And somebody stood up and said, "But Nazir, do you want us to be grasses and whistleblowers?" And I said, "No, I want you to be a nation of good neighbors. I want you to ensure that could be your child. That could be your friend's child, your brother's child, your sister's child. That could be somebody you care about. And that's why we all need to see as our responsibility." And
Nazir,
I think
thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to
stop overcomplicating it.
I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there because of time, but thank you. And absolutely, we all have a role to play in protecting children in our communities and protecting vulnerable people from sex abuse. Thank you so much for your time,
You're
Nazir.
most welcome.
We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Hafiz.
I'm now going to introduce our next panelist. Our next panelist is Shaukat Warich. Shaukat is a multi-award winning social entrepreneur and is currently the Chief Executive of Faith Associates, a pioneering enterprise developing strategies and operational capacity for third sector and commercial entities in the UK and abroad. Shaukat does a lot of work with mosques, and we are very lucky to have him here today to share with us his insights. Over to you, Shaukat.
Thank you, Keela. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Thank you to Khoei Foundation, SFI, and Urban Muslims Online. Really appreciate the invitation. I've been told I've got 10 minutes, and so this is a huge subject, and 10 minutes probably can't do justice to it, so I'll try my very best. But I'll start off with can I share with you a phone call I received yesterday? So I don't know whether this phone call came in because they saw that I was on a panel tomorrow, which is today, but it was a very, very difficult conversation. This girl rang my office and said she wanted to discuss a problem about an individual that is presenting himself as a very pious religious leader of a mosque in this country. I'm not going to go into the details of where, and she wanted to talk to somebody about this person. So she sent an email, and then we responded literally within half an hour of receiving this email, and we said, "Would you like to talk?" And she said yes, and she instantly sent her telephone number, and then we rang this young woman, and this young woman started to say that this person that she has seen online and promoting himself basically is a relative of this young woman, and this man has been abusing this girl and her mother, and this person is a family member. And to cut long story short, I asked this young woman, is this abuse happening now? She said, no, this abuse happened to me and her mother and her sister 20 years ago. But the trauma is still there, and it's affecting her every single day. And this person obviously, and then she started to explain what this man had done. And listening to her testimony or story was very, very harrowing. And one of the things that she was saying was that the reason why this person was abusing her and her mother is because she was a girl. And basically he said that why has God punished us by having a girl? And the stories of the abuse that this girl was facing and her mother had faced was so difficult to hear. Literally all of yesterday and last night was just reflecting on this girl's and her mother's And her mother, when she called, or when I called her mother was in the background explaining in Urdu what this person had done. And to cut a long story short, what was clear was that one is that the trauma was deep, and it's lasted over 20 years. This person, later on she rang again and said that basically that this person is still abusing them in different ways, and there's a restraining order on this person. But yet she said that this person has a perception and a promotion online about how pious he is and how we as an organization can stop that. And huge challenge for us, listening to that call and what should we do and how should we tackle that problem and how should we engage the different parties and how should we engage the institution that this individual is actually involved with. Many questions were raised by this call yesterday. Just to say to you here that this is a very big, active issue in our community. It's affecting thousands of people. The historic abuse within our community is there, and it's not being challenged. It's not being addressed, and it's a ticking time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb. If I may, I'll just quickly go through my presentation. Is it on the screen? I can't. Is it? Okay, great. So basically, Faith Associates, established in 2004, on the back of research that we did starting from 1999, working with various different institutions in the UK and abroad. Okay. It's gone off. I haven't touched that. Okay, great. So I'm going to try to speed up. So basically, we established this in 2004 specifically to look at institutional development, specifically within the faith sector, but we started to get a lot of response from mosques, madrasas, and charities, specifically in strategic leadership, governance, and how to kind of develop capacity. And one of the things that we saw quite quickly that was a big challenge in these organizations was issues around safeguarding. I wrote my first book in 2006 about mosque management, provided that for free, went viral, went around the world. We gave this book for free. And on the back of that book, we were asked to come in and do audits on places of worship. And the biggest project that the mosques were running at the time, and still are madrasas. We started to look at the madrasa system, and unfortunately, through the audits, we found that there was, unfortunately, considerable amount of abuse taking place in those organizations. At the moment, in the UK, there's around about 300,000 children in the madrasa system attending on a weekly basis. Big sector. Is it regulated? Is it formulated? Is there standards, as Nazir was talking about? There isn't at the moment. But Faith Associates basically started to look at this area and identify where we can help. And the three books that you can see, I think the screen's gone ahead one, but we wrote a book in 2009, and Julie was very actively involved in helping us to put that book together. This was madrasa management within a safeguarding context. And then later on with Birmingham City Council and the West Midlands area, we put together a multi-faith book about how to protect children and vulnerable adults within the faith sector. I think you've gone 2 slides ahead, but I've been asked to talk about the challenges. So in my opinion, at the moment, there's 4 big challenges. We've touched upon them already, but I'll quickly rush through them. One is shame. Shame is a big problem in our community. Shame from 2 aspects. One is basically talking about this issue about abuse, and secondly, about the whole issue around sexuality. How do you address this problem? Big problem. Basically, this is one of the reasons why there is historical abuse that needs to be talked about and addressed. And if you look at our co-religions, for instance, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, they are dealing with massive, massive challenges of abuse that took place maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. Is the Muslim community going to be able to deal with those issues when they are unearthed? Second issue, big challenge, is governance. The governance infrastructure within our places of worship is weak at best, if not non-existent in certain places. You cannot implement a safeguarding strategy if the governance in those institutions is weak. The third big challenge that we have at the moment is the whole issue around historical abuse, and when that is going to be unearthed, how is the sector going to deal with it? And how is the second and third generation going to view our institutions when that abuse is going to be mentioned? Fourthly is the whole issue around succession. Succession at the moment is a tactical issue which is causing problems, i.e. when our elders established those institutions in the 50s and 60s, some of them are beginning to let go. Who are they going to let it go to? And some of the people that they're letting go to are perpetuating the same problems. So there is a major succession issue which may actually perpetuate the same problems that we've had previously. The way forward, in light of the ISCSA report which came out this year, Faith Associates and myself were interviewed in this public inquiry. The two key issues that we need to focus on is attitudinal issues and institutional issues. Attitudinally, what I mean by that is two things. One is how the community deals with the whole issue around abuse, not just sexual, but physical, emotional, all the aspects of abuse. How do we as a community address it, tackle it, acknowledge it, and basically say that we want to deal with it, because the community are part of these institutions. Secondly, institutionally, what are the strategies to implement robust strategies to safeguard everybody that enters through that door? Whether young people, whether women, whether old people, people are disabled, anybody that walks through the door of the institution called a mosque or an Islamic center or a madrasa, how is that institution going to safeguard anybody that uses that facility? So there needs to be an institutional, deep-rooted strategy to protect anybody that walks through that door. So that requires a robust approach. It needs leadership, and we hope that, for instance, we hoped, and we still do hope, that organizations like Imam can develop that strategy. I know Faith Associates has developed standards, and we are working with Imam to make that happen. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, thank you.
But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shaukat. And we'll come back for questions after the break a bit later on for all our panelists. So I'm going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, who is Saliha Islam. Saliha, I have to say, is somebody who has worked for a very long time with victims and survivors of sexual abuse and all sorts of forms of abuse. She's really at the coal face in dealing with these issues. She's got many, many years of experience and is a wonderful friend. So Saliha currently has her own consultancy firm working on issues to do with safeguarding, child protection and trauma recovery, as well as other therapeutic interventions. She is uniquely placed to be an expert on sexual abuse due to the diversity of experience that she brings. She has worked at the NHS, in social services, in education, in the third sector at the NSPCC, and she also worked with the Child Exploitation Online Protection Service. Saliha, over to you.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. I don't think anyone can hear me. Can you hear me?
Do you want to use my mic?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say that thank you to the audience for coming, because it's extremely cold. But again, it's all ladies. You know, this is something that is, there are a few men, I can see that. But this is the issue. The issue is that this is sexual abuse by men, predominantly by men. And before I came, I was going to talk on something else, but I had so many victims and survivors ring me and say, Saliha, please, you need to talk on our behalf, and that's what I'm going to do today. It's precisely because of sexual abuse that I actually am in this work. So I want to tell you about a case. I'm going to call her Sumaya, it's not her real name. This must be going back about 30 years now. And basically she was sexually abused and she became pregnant by a religious figure. I was then the interpreter for this particular family. I was only a few years older than her. And I saw then what happened, how difficult it was for the family, for this girl. She was about roughly 13 years old. She had the pregnancy terminated and she ran away from home. Years later, when I had qualified as a social worker, she came in front of me. She was pregnant. She'd been in a violent relationship. She was taking drugs, promiscuous. She had left the deen completely. And she wanted to keep this baby. But the assessment that was made was that basically she wasn't able to do this, and the child was adopted. Now, for me, this just goes to show, and both previous speakers, Shaukat and Nazir, have talked about the whole thing around historical abuse and how that affects people. I think within that case, you can see what's happened to this young girl. She said to me, when I talked about faith and the family, she said, look, they let me down. She said, why didn't God intervene? Why didn't Allah intervene and help me? Even though she was an adult, she spoke with the child's voice because she couldn't understand why this man did this to her. You know, I think there are a few facts that I want to say because I know that there will be many people listening in, and I think one fact is that sexual abuse affects both body, mind, and soul. It's really important to understand that. As it's already been said, that the majority of abusers are male, and they are known to the family, they're known to the child. All this stranger danger, it's very rare. Another fact, yes, the majority of abusers are male, but there are also female sexual abusers as well. And many of us here who come from this background, we know that this is true as well. Sexual abuse is always underreported across, all boroughs, all different services. One thing that we tend to forget is about disabled children, because disabled children are much more exploited, they're abused, and they don't have a voice. And this is something that we tend to forget. And I think also for the abusers, because there'll be abusers listening in, that you may have avoided justice here, but you will not avoid divine justice. I think that's so important that we say that. I spent years going to imams and saying to them, this young girl, this woman has been abused. What's the punishment? What's going to happen? They didn't even understand what I was talking about. They had no idea what sexual abuse was. They were saying, girls should be dressed this way. And I said, look, these are 5-year-old children. What are you talking about? You need to get your act together. It's much better now. It's much better now. There are informed imams that understand this issue, but we are so far behind. When I worked for CEOP, I worked with a team that's seen as learned, and unfortunately, sometimes they are the people who are abusing, and they can get away with it. I wanted to remind people of what trauma is, and this is a really, I think, a good analogy. So, trauma is a psychic wound that hardens you psychologically and then interferes with your ability to grow and develop. It pains you, and now you're acting out of pain. It induces fear, and now you're acting out of fear. Trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. Trauma is that scarring that makes you less flexible, more rigid, less feeling, and more defended. When these children who have been sexually abused, when they grow up, they find it difficult to get into a relationship, a marital relationship. They have issues about themselves, they self-harm, it's been talked about. You can go on any site and look at the research that's been done. Most psychiatric wards, women who are in them have been sexually abused as part of their mental health history. We have to realize that this needs to stop. As religious people, you have a responsibility. There was another case where 2 boys were raped by a madrasa teacher. and one of the fathers, he rang me, and he said that the teacher and the senior leadership team sat with the parents, and he cried. He sat there and he cried, and he said, oh, it was the shaitan. The shaitan made me do it. And he cried and he asked for forgiveness. And they all, I think, sat there stunned. The parents needed time, of course, to kind of think about this. It was just such a shock what happened to both their boys. Then the man ran away. He fled. So I said to the father, I said, you've rang me. Tell me what this mosque is. Tell me who this person is. And we need to deal with it. And he said, let me think about it. And I said, no, you have to tell me. And he didn't. Now, the madrasa should have contacted the police straight away. They didn't do that. This man, and like many hundreds, I'm sure, of teachers, will just move away from that place and go and abuse other children. And that is on everyone's conscience. You know, the beauty of our religion is that we can do things wrong and we can ask Allah for forgiveness. But if you cause trauma and hurt to somebody else, you have to basically fix that. And, that's what I love about Islam, is that unfortunately, the deen is beautiful, but people, they're not. And we have to really get away from this cloak of, I'm beyond reproach. This is the key thing. We have to change the mindset. We could all sit here today and all of us can give you, parrot fashion, what you should do, how you should be, etc., what the strategies are, etc. But actually it's mindset. Do you want to change? Are you willing to realize that this child could be your child, could be your niece, your nephew? If you don't do that, then nothing will change, because I know, having worked in a mosque for nearly 20 years, that basically there are so many things that need to be done, but there has to be a commitment. If you don't have a commitment, you can have all the policies and procedures, but it won't help. So those things are really important. Yes, we do need to have different things, but we need to have people and we need to talk to them. We need for them to understand that they need to change. And I want to also say, finally, to the victims, the survivors, that it wasn't your fault. It's so important. It wasn't your fault, that basically you can heal. And if anyone wants to reach out, then reach out to us, reach out to me, because, people are stunned into silence. It's 30 years, 40 years. One woman, she rang me, she was 70 years old, and she said, Salaha, I want to tell you because I was sexually abused as a child. And I haven't told anybody, and I'm telling you so that before I die, I have mentioned this and I've told somebody. So these are the sorts of stories that come to us, and we need to bring this back and remind people that these are human beings, these are people. We have a responsibility as people of faith to make sure that this does not happen. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much, Saliha. That was really powerful and very moving. I'm going to move quickly on to our next panelist. So we are very lucky to have Strengthening Faith Institutions, SFI, with us today. And from SFI, we have Rabbi Natan and Nick Donaldson speaking to us. Between them, they have many years of experience. Rabbi Natan Levi is the program leader at SFI, and he looks specifically at safeguarding places of worship to make them safer. Nick Donaldson is the former head of Faith Charities Engagement for the Charity Commission for England and Wales, and he is now also working at SFI as a lead consultant for Faith Charities Engagement. Over to you both.
Thank you. Can you hear us okay? Yeah? Should we just use this one? Okay, let's use this one here. Where's that one? Is that one working?
This one's working.
We'll share.
Share. Okay, cool.
Great. Okay. And can we drop the slides up too?
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about this incredibly important topic. We're going to talk about lessons from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, also to some extent the lessons that we have as representative of SFI working with faith institutions across England. Yeah, give me the second slide, please. In terms of what SFI does, just briefly, we work with religious institutions, faith centres, places of worship, splitting it down into 3 core areas. So basically the key things that a place of worship or place of worship and supplementary school deals with. So the building management, the financial management, and of course safeguarding. And we run a program of support for organisations around safeguarding, including bespoke training for faith centres, and we provide ongoing support to get policies and procedures right. Sorry, I don't know if it's crackling a bit here, but we think this is really important. This has been said several times. And working at the Charity Commission, this was really striking as well. There is a huge difference between having a policy, a safeguarding policy and procedure, and being an organisation that actually uses that safeguarding policy and procedure and makes sure that it protects the children within its care, but also promotes safeguarding as a wider issue. Nathan, I don't know if you want to take this. Talk about that.
Just in general, we're showing a map up here of that the SFI program isn't specifically for any one type of faith, it's for all faiths, and it goes across England. And the way we work is throughout the country, there are coordinators on the ground specifically working in those communities. Next slide.
In terms of the training we offer, we recognise that religious communities are, well, they're very varied, but also working with, for example, Islamic communities, often volunteer-led institutions. We need to provide training that's easy to access, that's at times that people can access, and that's also sufficiently simple to understand for people who've got a lot going on. And we aim to provide it at times in places which is accessible to faith communities, so not, we sort of accommodate prayer times. We make sure we're in the geographical areas where people need the support. And we apply religious expertise, so we have people from different faiths applying their expertise, but we base all of our training on UK law and best practice. So that's the plug. I'm just going to talk about ICSA now.
We're going to jump into some of the ICSA and pick up on really what Shokat was speaking about earlier as well. Just in terms of a very brief overview. Stop here. Really brief overview. The concern that happened is that a lot of the faith leaders, when they got up in ICSA, they said there are no issues here. And this was across the board, even within my own faith, the Jewish faith. They said there are no issues to see here, there's no problems to be seen here. But as we can tell you from our own research, there are issues really quickly to point them out. This is from some data from 2019. Of the 446 places of worship that completed a health check, only 64% didn't have a designated safeguarding lead at all. Of those who had a safeguarding lead, the training was outdated or inadequate, and of those that had a safeguarding lead that had up-to-date training, there was a real dearth of those who had a female designated safeguarding lead. For, as we mentioned, places like madrasas, Sunday schools, yeshivas are filled with children, filled with girls as well as boys, and having a female representative that they could go to as a trained safeguarding lead was key, and only 17% had that in place at the level of engagement. Not only that, but only 37% of those institutions had DBS checks. One of those key moments. Who is in your center? Who are your teachers? Who are your staff? Who are engaging with these children? Only 37% had adequate DBS checks. So there really is, and ICSA picks up on this issue again and again in their study. Next slide. Shokat mentioned it in his witness statement. I mentioned it in the witness statement that I said for SFI along similar lines. And you can see here that 60% of our institutions across the board don't have adequate policies, don't have adequate procedures, don't have DBS checks. This is an issue that needs to be addressed now.
I'll just talk about some of the other issues identified by ICSA. So lack of safe recruitment.
One more slide.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Lack of safe recruitment practices. So basically just not vetting people, people coming internationally, not undertaking any checks, recruiting them without proper verification that actually they weren't going to abuse children or anybody. A key thing identified by ICSA, barriers to reporting abuse, and this has come up today, victim blaming, shame and honour. A number of people have mentioned that. Some really incredibly harrowing stories of victim blaming and just the ridiculous notion, in my opinion, that it is a source of shame for somebody to have been abused. The abhorrent notion that was covered earlier that really needs to be addressed, that it is a source of shame for the person to be, the person who's been abused should somehow feel shame about that and should even be mistreated or even forced to marry their abuser. And this came up in sort of in a number of faiths. Abuse of power by religious leaders, and so we were talking earlier, like, you know, how much of a barrier is it to be able to report to these powerful, nearly always men in a community, that you have been abused, particularly if they know that there is, so if they know the other people involved, the abuse, well, so the abuse of power is actually a very broad issue. ICSA talks about the abuse of religious texts and so on, but please do read the ICSA report, and the link will be on there when it comes around. Gender disparity, so not just the power disparity between men and women, but, well, to start off with, the fact that there are very few people in positions of responsibility, very few women in positions of responsibility or senior responsibility within a number of religious institutions, but also the wider power disparity, so that women are not trusted or do not have the same voice, do not have the ability to challenge these issues within communities. And sort of linked to this kind of power problem is the desire to manage allegations internally. So failing to report things to statutory agencies, to local authority and to police, and protecting individuals' reputation above that of the people who've been abused, which is utterly wrong. ICSA talked about the hesitance around discussing issues of sexuality within communities. So lack of discussion about sexuality, in some cases even the lack of vocabulary to talk about issues around sexuality and sexual abuse. Yet another barrier. I mean, just the number of barriers was enormous. Lack of child protection policies and procedures, or never or rarely looking at them. That's amongst institutions. And also, much more than that, you know, not actually just having a mindset, as I think we've already discussed, about preventing abuse. And lack of training and access to support, and that is those latter two areas are two areas that SFI can assist with. Could you go on to the next slide? Yeah. Just in terms of the recommendations from ICSA, I imagine that a number of people here aren't even aware of this, but they have recommended that all religious organisations should have a child protection policy and supporting procedures, including advice and guidance on responding to disclosures of abuse and the needs of victims and survivors. So focused on the needs of the people who've actually been abused, updated regularly with professional advice and regular compulsory training for those in leadership positions and those who work with children and young people. So if you go back to your faith institutions, please point them to this and saying, have you got this? Are you doing this? This is a minimum requirement. And just again to mention, this is something SFI can support with. We provide advice and guidance on child protection policies and procedures, and we provide training. We're nearly there. Next slide, please. So next steps for anybody, please, well, I mean, these are just such simple steps. DBS checks for staff working with children. SFI provides guidance on getting the right level of DBS checks. It can be complex, we know, for some people. Getting designated safeguarding leads in place. Getting policies and procedures on including how your organisation will respond to abuse. So thinking about how your organisation would handle an allegation. Would you want your son or daughter to come up against the circumstances that you provide or the situation that you provide in your organisation if they wanted to report an allegation? You know, do you provide the service that you would expect from others? training, and finally, really important to get support either from ourselves or from Faith Associates or another organisation like 31A or NSPCC. And just as a final reminder, if you do find DBS checks complex, a lot of people do, SFI works with Disclosure and Barring Service to provide specific guidance broken down by each faith, and we've just shown the Islamic example there, but that means it talks about how, well, so it shows you different roles within mosques and madrasas, so drivers, trustees, kitchen staff, it's a sort of full range, imams, and it talks about what level of check you can get for them. If you need any more support on that, please do come to SFI.
We're going to save the questions, of course, till the end, but just to say, as a wrap-up, that there is a wealth. The first step here is recognizing that there is a problem in our communities, all of our communities. The second step is understanding that there is a lot of support at this table even. Please come up to all of us afterwards and say, how can I get support from my faith organization to make the changes that are required? And third, it's making that huge shift, that safeguarding isn't about safeguarding your organization or safeguarding your reputation, it's about safeguarding the children who come into our centers.
Thank you so much to Natan and Nick, and you're absolutely right, it's about safeguarding children and protecting individuals. On that note, we're now going to take a short coffee break. I think we've got, is it 5 minutes for coffee break? 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll be here roughly at 3:07. Thank you. Very precise. Ask the panelists to come and sit down again, and all the audience members could take their seats as well. We're going to start in a minute or so. So I just want to check that we're ready. Are we ready in terms of our online? Yep. Okay, brilliant. So welcome back, and thank you so much to our panelists. It was very, very powerful and insightful to hear your presentations. So now we've got time for questions, and I'd first like to open up questions to our audience here in the centre. We've got a question over here. Thank you. And if I could just ask if you could just keep questions as concise as possible, please. Thank you. That's for everybody.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah. So I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for many years. I've mostly worked within Muslim communities, particularly in one London borough. So anyone who in this room or listening in who thinks sexual abuse doesn't occur in the Muslim communities, I can tell you it does. Perpetrators are uncles, brothers, fathers, grandfathers, imams, religious teachers, everywhere. The perpetrators are everywhere. So as a social worker, it's not a question really, it's just something for people to be aware about, is when a child is brave enough to disclose that she has been sexually abused, statutory sectors get involved, social workers, police, etc. Now this might be controversial, but I'm going to say this often results in secondary trauma for the young person, because these organisations don't understand this young person's life. They want the abuse to stop, but they don't necessarily want to be separated from their parents, from their mother, from their grandmother, but that often happens. And that can lead to lifelong estrangement from the family. So the issues that we've been discussing today about trying to overcome this whole issue of shame, of blaming the victim, they're very, very pertinent issues. And I just wish, I've been a social worker for over 30 years. We've had these conversations about child sexual abuse in the Muslim community 20, 30 years ago. Nothing has moved forward, nothing at all. I don't know why that is, because as people have said, child sexual abuse affects every community, perhaps because, as Muslims we're under attack for so many other things. This is another thing that we are going to be attacked about. People are slow in coming forward. Really, I just wanted to raise those as the issues.
Thank you.
They're not questions, they're just
those
issues.
are really important issues. And if I could ask you, Sahalat, then, off the back of that, children don't want to be separated from their family. So what can we do then in that case?
I mean, look, it's not on, by the way. So I know Nadira very well, and we have worked on this issue 20 odd years ago, actually, and I agree with her. The issue is that it's something that we need to work with in terms of organizations and statutory organizations, because the way that children from our communities are perceived is that we have to remove them to protect them. And is there another way? Another model. The model very specifically is that, you know, the child is in danger, you remove that child, but actually where are you taking them? What we know is that there are not enough foster carers, there are not enough services that cater for their needs. And so this is a conversation that needs to go beyond, you know, this, the kind of faith institution, but we need to be part of that and say what solutions are available, what else can work. And I wanted to bring in Rabbi Natan here because I know that within the Jewish community, you have like services that are within the community, and I think that's something that we can learn from.
Within the Jewish community, there are, because of the same issue, it's very hard for people to say and be honest with the authorities because of a number of cultural, religious sort of barriers or boundaries they feel, and the issue of they'll be taken away, and then they won't be able to lead a life in a Jewish home or a kosher home in the way that they want to be brought up. So because of that, a number of different models have taken place where the community itself has set in place foster care, ways of ensuring that children who are taken away from their parents have other options within their own community. Once again, it's worth considering how that could be a model for other faiths, but definitely the model is there because we have to have as few barriers as possible for people to be honest about what's happening.
Thank you. And we've had some questions come in online, so I'm just going to ask both of those questions, and then anybody from the panel can answer them. So the first question is, how can we speak to our children about this without frightening them or making them untrusting of family members? And at what age should we be talking to our children about these issues? Another question is, how can we tackle the Baradari culture that contributes to this sort of sense of shame and izzat and honor and things? So I don't know who would like to answer.
With children, I mean, in terms of like, children are taught at school now, so organizations like Childline come in and they talk about abuse. What's really important is that parents need to be part of this. We can't, I mean, I remember one particular school, it's an Islamic school, they had ripped out the pictures of naked bodies. And I was like, well, how are you going to understand what, you know, your body parts are? You can't do things like that. And they were challengeable. But as parents, you have to realize that the school or other organizations can't do everything for you. You need to be comfortable with understanding about body parts and sex and sexuality. There are lots of resources out there that can help you. So that's number one. The other thing is that, you know, I know you're not going to be a specialist with your children, but if you don't understand, then get help. You know, there's women and, I mean, parents do so many things. What, you know, you can create hubs where you come and you meet and you discuss these things. I think madrasas are another place. Not only should they be teaching an Islamic curriculum, but they need to be talking about life. They need to be talking about sex and sexuality, all of those things, because it's part and parcel of life. So I think that's very important. And I think in terms of the Baradari, I think where are the men? They need to tackle this with us, because as women often we don't have a voice, because we'd be told to sit down or go to the back of the room and, you know, make the biryani or something. So I think the issue is that we need to have the men here. They're the ones who need to tackle the misogyny, the patriarchy, and all those issues that are going on.
Really briefly, I'll just say one quick thing. I'm going to take off my SFI hat and put on, as a parent, as a father. Sometimes the issue is when I walk into a synagogue, it feels like a place for the family, a community. It should be safe. You know, we let our kids run around there. As we said before here, it's often up to parents and guardians to say to our children, look around you. Make sure you have a voice. Is there a poster with someone with a safeguarding lead in this place we've just walked into? When I walk into a synagogue, I say to my kids, where's the safeguarding poster? If it's not a safeguarding poster, I want a model behavior to go up to a trustee, a chair, a secretary, and say, hi, I'm looking for who the safeguarding lead is here, before I feel comfortable and safe leaving my children in a place where I'm going to go pray and they're going to be running around, and I want to ensure that. So it's up to us, I think, as parents, as guardians, to model the kind of behavior where our children can speak up.
I'll just speak briefly because I'm not an expert in either of these questions, but except to say that firstly, I think we need to distinguish between the role of the place of worship or the faith community in terms of protecting against abuse within either its own four walls or that's perpetrated by the people who work in it, trustees, staff and volunteers, and the wider community abuse undertaken by representatives of people in that religious community. And the two are obviously linked. Yes, so I think to sort of reiterate those points, if there could be more of a more exemplifying of the behaviours that would prevent abuse, so more designated safeguarding leads, more ease with which people could access people to talk about abuse, more speaking about abuse, then within the place of worship itself, then that would be a good start to affect the community issues. But I just go back to one other thing, the thing I said earlier, which is that if every faith institution could really think hard about what the reality would be like for somebody coming forward to them with an allegation of abuse, particularly if it was somebody involved within the committee or it was somebody well known to the trustees, what would the reality of that be like? I think a lot of progress we've made.
Thank you. And if I could open up to the audience again, if anybody would like to ask a question. We've got two hands up at the back, so if I could take Julie's question and then the lady in the blue top as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for Khoei for providing the most outstanding backdrop of a conference I think I've ever seen. So yeah, and it's very good and brave of them to do this conference here, so just wanted to acknowledge that. I mean, there's so many things coming up for me. I really appreciate all of what has been said and all of the work that you're all doing. I think one thing I wanted to just drop into the mix here, whether I've got a question or not, I don't know, but there's something very powerful and disturbing happening in Muslim communities when it comes to male power. It's not specifically just Muslims, but of course it's something that we're talking about here. When women, as some of us have, even in this room, tried to speak up and do something about some of these issues, we are treated in some of the most appalling ways by other Muslim men. As a young woman said on Twitter recently, don't talk to me about Islamophobia when the most backlash I get for the work I'm trying to do is from Muslim men. And I just want to really say that we need to really join up the dots more when it comes to the work that the amazing work that SFI are doing, and Shaukat's not here, but the work that he's doing as well, behind the scenes, plugging away, trying to get the standards up. But you know, as the Imam Khalid Latif said in America recently, also talking about Islamophobia, don't talk to me about Islamophobia when women aren't even allowed in some of our mosques. And as I think it was Nick said just now, you know, women need to be in positions of leadership, but also, and that will take, I think, decades yet, but also how do we join up the dots really between some of the work that's being done here, the kind of work that Shaukat's doing with women, either individuals or women's organizations that actually I know for a fact are trying to do so much work on this issue to raise awareness, to create education. When it comes to things like putting posters up in mosques, it's not going to be the mosques that are going to do it. One or two will do it. It's going to have to be other people that have respected enough to go in and put those posters up on those toilet doors, as Jewish Women's Aid have done in synagogues. It's not the synagogues that do it. Jewish Women's Aid did it. And just to pick up on what's said about the Jewish community, one of the most important things that we can learn from the Jewish community on this and so many other things is the way it has been self-funded through philanthropy and people funding. So Jewish Women's Aid is a good example, as among many others, where the community itself funds it. So we've got so much money in the Muslim communities going out of the country to fund stuff abroad. And I think we just need to think about how we join up the dots on these issues, because unless we do that, everyone working in silos, it becomes almost impossible, particularly for women, to even speak about this stuff in public.
Thank you, Julie. And I think the lady with the blue top at the back would also like to ask something.
So I have a few questions. Okay, so my first one is about the Muslim culture itself. How do you think that our own religious practices and our culture actually plays into this, to the role of like silencing, even like child sexual abuse and silencing the victims themselves? I personally have spotted a few things. There's just a little personal experience. When I was in school, we had this teacher, he was Moroccan. He actually brought out all the verses in the Quran that permit child marriage and even domestic violence and all that. I wonder how this has actually affected attitudes towards young Muslim girls. Another thing is, how do you? I don't know how the families have responded when they've actually had, young girls or even boys come out and talk about, the child sexual abuse. Because I think their family's response also affects them and will make them feel scared to come forward. They might feel like they'll get shouted at or disowned, which is a form of abuse. Another thing is, how do you think hijab has actually played a part in young girls being sexually abused by adult men? Because personally I found that as soon as I started wearing hijab, I became treated as an adult in the worst ways. It's what this term describes, adultified, where we were treated like we were adults, we weren't treated like we were children. And I think it's because of the way that we are seen. As soon as you start wearing hijab, some people think that that's when you become eligible for marriage. And I think then you start being seen as differently by men. But I think that, they're predators, but I just want to know, in your experience, what factor do you think has played a part in young girls and boys becoming targets and then being silenced?
So we've got some very important and deep questions there. So we've got a question about the misuse of religious teachings from the Quran. We've got a question about how do families respond, and we've had a question from online as well actually about that. What if a parent doesn't respond in the way they should? And then we have a question about the hijab. So if I could come to you, Natan, about the misuse of religious teachings, if you don't mind, because you're our rabbi on the panel. And Salih, if I could come to you about the what to do, in terms of hijab, sort of, I guess, almost sexualizing, basically, young children, and then also about what happens if a family member or a parent or loved one doesn't respond appropriately.
Being a rabbi does not give me a say over how a lot of the questions about how Islam is operating. So I always try to speak. First of all, I wanted to really just address what Julie said. Julie, 100%. Your work that you're doing is really, really important, and all of our research shows that if women are in positions of power, then the voices of children in those communities are taken much more seriously. Their roles, their place, how space works for them, their welcome, right? The voices of those and safeguarding issues are taken much, much more seriously if there are women trustees in an institution. Just the research 100% shows that. So, all value to the work you're doing, and long may continue and grow. In terms of, there's a couple issues, and here we're talking about, is it a religious problem? Is it a cultural problem? Maybe we shouldn't even try to make that distinction. What's happening, at least within what I see within my faith community, is the desire to keep a minority faith, which feels to be under attack, like parts of the Jewish community do, I'm sure like parts of the Islamic community do, is so strong that desire keeps people from willing to share with the outside world what's really going on. Again and again and again, you see if there's a perpetrator of abuse, rather than point that person out or tell the police, what they'll do is they'll just ship that person off, unfortunately, to another country, right? And try to bury as much as possible, so that when the victims look around, what they see is not that they have been heard. What they see is that they've been told to basically to go back to being normal, that nothing has happened here. It happens again and again and again, and there are a couple of organizations that are really fighting within the Jewish community to have that shift, and it's going to take a long-term piece of work. Because as we know, our religions are beautiful and wonderful and moral and ethical. However, they can be twisted around because there's so much and so complex to say whatever that individual in the position of power wishes they would say, right? And the transformation is going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of knocking against what, should be doors but feels like, walls currently. And I think the only real approach is to be as transparent and shine as much light on these issues as possible. So when we have cases that are where you see individuals saying things like you're hearing about abuse relationships, power of the father over the family, all of the some ancient texts that are now been used again as though they're modern concepts, the key, I think, is to recognize the problem and to be transparent as possible and try to really work on who here can I turn to, as difficult as it is, to join together in a coalition across the faiths, because we're always much stronger across faiths than we are as individuals within our faith, and say, who else can I join to as an interfaith gesture to make sure that those are not the strongest leaders in our community.
Thank you, and I hope that SFI, Faith Associates, and Minab as well will do some work with imams and interfaith organisations to address this kind of misuse of our religious teachings.
I just wanted to say that I agree with you totally, Rabbi Nathan, and also that in ICSA they do talk about how religious texts are abused. And the thing is, look, abusers will use whatever they can to basically carry out their, nasty, heinous crime. So, and this is the thing, because they're talking to children, and children don't have that ability to understand. And remember, our texts, they're not, there's so many levels of understanding. So the thing is, you're going to be, told something completely different because they want to basically groom you to abuse you. That's the sad thing. When you talk about families, the issue is that, look, the whole thing around, and if it's in particular with sexual abuse, it's a taboo. It's been a taboo for a long time, and it continues to be a taboo. And the thing is, the parents are going through their own issues, but they are responsible for their children. They are responsible. Now, if somebody is going through abuse and they can't talk to their parents, I'm sure they will find somebody they can talk to, whether that's a teacher, an aunt, or somebody to be able to confide in and to basically get some help and support. People don't necessarily need to go to the police straight away. They can go to other services. There are organizations like even the Muslim Youth Helpline. You can go to them. Both Akila and I were part of that. So you can, it's a really horrible thing that children have to feel that they're alone. But unfortunately, sometimes that's how it is. But we want to tell those people who are listening right now or watching this that if they're in that predicament, there are organizations out there who can help them. And I think the issue around hijab, that's kind of quite strange for me. I didn't wear hijab until I was an adult, so I'm not really sure kind of how to answer that. But again, I think it's about how men see women, it's about misogyny, it's about patriarchy, and much of what else has been talked about today. And again, that needs to be challenged. And I think that, who are these teachers? It goes back to a lot of the things that we said today. Who are these teachers? Who are teaching our children? We need to know that. And it has to be beyond a DBS check, because as I always say, the DBS check is as good as, it is on the day that it's been done. But also, if they've never been caught, nobody's come, and talked about it, then they haven't ever been charged. So the DBS may or may not mean much, but it still needs to be done. So we have to work together, and I also believe that we have to look at good practice. We look at good practice across faiths, as Rabbi Nathan has said, and we need to work together. And we need to have women in positions of power, because then it balances things. So I hope that's helpful.
Could I just add one really quick point? Sorry. Just that something ICSA talked about as well was about how a number of religious communities consider themselves as conservative. We have conservative views, small c, that is. But that people need to understand that you can still be conservative and talk about issues of sexuality and sex and sexual abuse. The two things are not mutually exclusive, and they get mixed up. People say because we're pure people, or we're conservative in this area, we don't like to talk about these things. Well, that's not the right approach. Actually, in order to be conservative, and in order to preserve the things that you believe in, you need to discuss those issues precisely so that you can prevent abuse.
Thanks, Nick. And I've got a couple of questions for you, but just before I ask you the questions that have come in for you, I just want to give a comment on the hijab thing. I think what you have said, the root cause of that is the attitudes, basically, towards young girls and children and women. And if you look at, for example, in parallel at the Everyday Sexism Project, there are a lot of young girls who are school age who talk about receiving a lot of sexual harassment when they're in their school uniform and things like that. So it's not the garment, actually, it's the attitude and the misogynistic attitude which is the root cause of those issues. The garment is almost like a tool. For Muslim communities it might be the hijab, for other communities it might be a school uniform, and I think that's really key. Sorry, I just thought I'd add my own sort of 2 pence there as chair. Nick, we've got a couple of questions for you, and the first question is, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to work in family law or help children from broken homes? And the other question is, somebody is aware that a local mosque has no compliance in place. They don't have the right policies. And, how would you advise somebody to get this investigated, or, to try and get the mosque to kind of sort their sort of governance out?
I know so much more about the second question than I do about the first. So I don't know if anybody else want to talk about getting into family law. But in terms of if you think there's poor governance at a mosque or any other faith institution, if they're a charity, then the trustees have legal duties. This includes to manage finances properly. This includes to protect anybody who comes into contact with the charity, including not just on their premises but externally. It includes to make sure that any messages that are shared under the auspices of the charity are trying to achieve your charitable purposes. So you can complain to the Charity Commission if you feel that they are failing to meet those duties. If they're failing to meet something which is a legal requirement, if there's a strict or criminal requirement, criminal legal requirement, so if they're breaking the law, then you can report them to the police. I think the main thing from having worked with the Charity Commission is that it's really important to, as much as possible and as much as safe as possible, to get evidence together to show why what you're alleging is true, and then the Charity Commission are more likely to be able to investigate and to look into it. Just one other thing in terms of governance for organisations, to really think hard about the constitution of your board and about getting the right people on your board, including women, who are going to ensure that your who are going to take the responsibility of running the organisation more seriously than the power that the role brings, or the prestige, or the reputation, or any other factor. Actually, if you're being a trustee, it's a very responsible position. I hope I've answered that to some extent. I don't know so much about getting involved in family law. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
And just one more point on this question. What we found is, Nick and I showed that slide about the failures of institutions to have the right policies and the DBS checks. It's not because they didn't want to, for the most part, or they're trying to hide things for the most part. Mainly it was because the trustees are volunteers. And safeguarding is really complex. And there's a lot of other things, especially if you're, post-COVID and money's an issue of just keeping the lights on and the heat on, and that you're going to deal with first because your time is so limited. So we definitely say organizations, I'm biased, like SFI, or there's a lot of support out there, And it just sort of reaching out and asking for that help to say, okay, we're struggling to get the policies in place. And we're looking forward to get some training, and we just haven't been able to make that happen. That's where hopefully an organization like SFI or 31/8 can, our Faith Associates really can come in handy. Because we found that when people when you show them the right approach, they do want to go down the path for better safeguarding. Because everyone wants to take care to make sure that children are safe in our centers.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to the audience again now. If anybody's got any questions from the audience. We've got the gentleman over here has a question.
My name is Zaman. First of all, I'd like to give a thanks to all of you to organize these events. I have a few questions, which is I have seen. There is a number of male victims, and sometimes, what we had seen before, the challenges, sometimes they feel shame to share what happened to them. Sometimes they don't know what happened. Even sometimes when they go to the people or the family, nobody wants to believe that. They said, oh, you are a man, how is it going to be happen? So when he said to one person and he faced these things, he stopped. I found like one person, it happened to him while he was, I think, 14 or 15. He told his parents, none of them believed. Then he told his doctors. So what Sister Saleha said, there's lots of paperwork, all the charities and the mosques and all these things, but we are not implementing. If you call the mosque people for any events, hardly you will find one person, but how many trustees? Almost 5, 6, a number of people, they don't come. So how we can implement, how we can educate the people's parents and the mosques, because hardly, I don't think so, they read all the paperwork. If they will read, they will know. So this is the question, how we can protect the male victim with them, because if something happened to the female, mostly people, they believe, but they don't believe if something happened to the male. So how we can keep the balance and how we can educate the parents and the mosques and the schools. Thank you.
Thank you. I think just to say that actually a lot of victims aren't believed, irrespective of their gender, unfortunately.
I think I mentioned as one of the facts that basically both male and female children, young people are abused. And I think that, as Akila's just said, just generally to be believed is an issue. But we have to believe them. And this is why the whole issue around when people tell somebody and they're not heard, they go inside. Literally, the trauma happens inside. And that's why it's so important to be able to reach out. Now, if you know who this person is, then they need to still go and get some help. And this is where people lose trust. You see, the whole thing about why sexual abuse is so heinous and so terrible is because not being believed, not being heard, not being seen. And that's why we do need to help those victims. We need to tell them there is hope and that they can heal and they will be also heard. But we need to, all of you here today, if you know of these people, tell them to get help, even if it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago that this happened. But unfortunately, the reality is that many people aren't heard and they're not listened to because of their own, the people, the family. They're like, oh my gosh, this is, shameful. What are people going to say? Exactly like you said, how did this happen? What does it mean for a man or a young boy to be sexually abused? They can't think of what that actually means. And so we have to, I think earlier we said today that education is so important. I think actually Nazir said that. We have to educate at all levels. Children, parents, community, our faith institutions, everybody has a role to play. And then hopefully we can begin to see some change.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? The lady over here with the glasses.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just as I'm listening and reflecting on today and going on past experience as well, it feels like there's a bit of a gap. ultimate accountability always comes down to the fact that it's a crime. And where do you go with that? Do you go to the police and stand in front of a jury and go through the whole process and on the balance of probability not end up with the success that you're after and the validation that you're after and live with that for the rest of your life, as many people do? Do you then stand up, say what's happened to me, and then live with honour-based abuse for the next 30, 40 years of your life? It feels like there's a real gap between being able to hold organisations accountable, because the only option there is to go down the criminal route, and that's where the ultimate accountability is. Are there structures that you are aware of that can be used to hold people to account in the current, apart from maybe taking someone on a private civil case, which has its own costs but is an option? What is there in place beyond the police that can hold individuals to account, that doesn't cost the individual the shame and the pain and the judgment and the personal retributions that do come back when they try?
That's a very good question.
I think it's a very complex question, and you're absolutely right. There are gaps. And the thing is that what I'm hearing, what you're saying, is that there's the gap in terms of the healing for that person. Okay, that is important, I'm telling you, because what happens often that I find is that people haven't healed, and then they basically go out and become active, and they are looking for retribution through another means because they didn't get that justice. And it is very difficult. I mean, I was speaking earlier in the break that to go through that process of investigation, going to court, etc., is incredibly hard. And some people will do it because they think that's part of their getting justice. And other people, they will stop. They won't go as far. But I think in all of that, they have to go through a journey of healing in order to be able to make that decision. I'm sorry, I don't know what other organizations are out there who can basically fill that gap, because we're not there yet in terms of even acknowledging that this happens. Until we can acknowledge this, that this actually happens, then we may be able to create spaces, but at the moment, it's two continuums, basically. It's this or the other.
As I'm handing over to Nata, if I could just add, I think, Salih's absolutely right. We don't have organisations that can do that. We're not in that space yet. But there have been some high-profile cases of men who are leaders in our communities who maybe not have engaged in child sexual abuse, but have engaged in sexual harassment behaviour and inappropriate behaviour towards women in their lives. But they're still given a platform. And I very much think that, at the very least, organisations and groups in the Muslim communities can stop giving those people a platform. There you go.
That was basically...
Oh, I'm so sorry I took your...
No,
please.
But it's the same thing. Our goal is firstly proactive, that our places of worship, our synagogues, our gurdwaras, our mosques should be places where a perpetrator or potential perpetrator should feel really scared to go in because they know people are watching. They know there's a concern. They know there's a safeguarding lead. We found again and again and again that proactively, if there are signs saying this is how we do safeguarding, this is the people who are watching for safeguarding, and if you have any issues, here's the person you can call who's in charge of safeguarding. There's someone on the ground who just thinks about it night and day, who stays awake at night, concerned about their center being a safer place. That's one of the keys. Reactively, it's a whole different consideration. I personally don't have a lot of experience with it, but we found again and again that those people who are survivors will say, I wish I had said something. I wish I had been transparent in public, because that allowing that person to continue and go on to other victims is part of the trauma that they experience. Right, there is no really good solution. Going through the police process is tremendously painful. But within that process, I think there can be healing and potential for healing.
Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you so much to our panelists. I thought it would be nice now just to ask each of you to give maybe a short reflection before we... Is there one more question? Have I missed? Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so I think we can quickly take final questions. So if anybody else has got a question, along with the sister at the back in the blue top.
This is kind of more of a suggestion and then a little bit of a question as well, but it was to the audience member with the glasses. You mentioned about, there was a gap that we wanted to fill it. I think people are filling that gap, but through vigilante justice. So there are online organizations who actually create a sting for predators. And even during lockdown and with the rise of the use of social media, they're finding that there are a lot more predators going online and luring and grooming children. I think there were some things that the criminal justice is actually working on, like making it less scarier for victims to come forward and using pre-recorded interviews and all that. I just don't think it's enough. I think we do actually have to, set up these predators, because there are a lot out there. Even child pornography now is being flooded on social media, and the more children are accessing social media now, they're becoming more and more victims. But yeah, I just don't think. I think having Muslim organizations as well. It's very, it's validifying and it's much better. But do you think we can work on that? Actually, having more Muslims involved in seeking justice and actually holding predators accountable, because that is it helps the victims feel like the world is a safer place when they actually find that people are on their side.
Thank you for that question. Before I get the panelists to answer that, I just want to check if anybody else has got a question. You've got a question, please go ahead.
Growing up as a child, I remember when we were young, the idea of adults engaging with children was normalized. It wasn't something big, it was very normal. But nowadays, if you see a child, I have 2 children, but if I see a child, sometimes I want to play with him, I want to just give him a sweet or something. That's considered to be a taboo, or it's considered to be what are you doing? Now, is that helping the safeguarding idea that has been introduced and has been, let's say, supported, or is it something bad? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Thank you. And if there are no more questions, Salah, if I could ask you to answer the first question, and perhaps Nick and Natan can answer the second question.
I'm aware of some of the kind of groups that are trying to make people accountable. And to a point, I agree. But my issue is that actually you can't totally bring them to justice in that way. There has to be the criminal system. It really has to, because there's no one managing that space. There's no one actually, who are these people? And there is a system, and it may be flawed, but actually we have to go through that. So for me, there has to be a point when if you come across these people, you can't then basically continue to carry on doing this kind of vigilante kind of issue. You have to basically bring in the system to be able to sort them out and bring them to justice.
And Nick or Natan, would you like to answer the second question?
Yeah. Nick and I are both thinking about this one. It's a really good question, Yusuf, about because especially within our faith communities, we think of ourselves as a very tight-knit community where you want to take care of everyone and have everyone take care of you. And it's a place where, one of the few places where we can feel safe and secure, right? Just being here, it always feels like just warm and welcoming, hospitable. I tend to think that if we had our structures in place with really strong policies, and the people running our centers knew what their policies were and were implementing them, the whole process would be much more open and clear, and we would feel more comfortable just being in those centers, right? Engaging with when it's okay. Just really simple things, like if there's a madrasa or yeshiva group of students coming in, right, that has to be separated from the worshipers going out, right, at some level, so that there's really clear guidance about if there's students there, who's in charge of them at a given time, right? Where are my kids when I send them off to the yeshiva setting? With those clear structures, I think a lot of other elements can fall into place really simply. But it's an ongoing question, and I have the same sort of issues about, like, you know, what's appropriate, what's okay. Once we have something really clear and transparent, though, I tend to think that those things can often fall into place as well.
Well, thank you so much for those very interesting questions from our audience and from the people watching online. I just want to ask our panel just to share some final reflections as we sort of close the conference. Nick, if I could start with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for hosting and running the conference. I think I just want to stress how ridiculous as an idea it seems that that communities might not take this issue seriously. Like, of all the issues that you might be concerned about, the sexual abuse of people within your own community, how utterly abhorrent that is, and actually to challenge people within religious organisations, and to challenge myself in my own role in working in religious organisations, like, if we can't get this right, but we can get, you know, sending some money to a project overseas right, and we can spend loads of time doing that, where are we up to? You know, and sorry, just one final thing. ICSA talked about how religious organisations have a moral purpose. Well, if we're supposed to be getting morality right, how can we not be starting with this most obvious element of morality?
Thank you. Natan.
We've said a lot here, and at some level, I look forward to hearing us talk less in this panel and more about your solutions as members of communities, as leaders of communities, as future leaders of communities, about what will make the biggest change. We're always, from SFI, we're always looking to how do we do this better? How do we make this work? How do we make this work within communities? And what the ICSA report is just a piece of paper, right? And it's unclear that government's going to work that hard to make it happen. The real work has to be from the communities themselves. The real work has to grow from the ground up. When parents and guardians and leaders and faith leaders, to be totally fair, are standing up and saying, I want to see change, and I'm going to make change happen within my own community, that's when we'll see the real effects. And that's when what's written down in it's a piece of paper, as a recommendation, will become alive and will make change.
Thank you. And Saliha.
This is just the beginning. There have been plenty of reports similar to ICSA before, but although this is kind of more in depth. And like some people have said, nothing has changed. But we have to create that change because people are in pain. They're in a lot of pain, they're suffering. And they're now crying out for that help. And all of us have a role in this. And we do need to work together at whatever level that we can. And I think there are movements like we've spoken about today that will help create that change. I think COVID has been a wake-up call for everybody. You've got to look at your life. What sort of life are you leading? What's your purpose? And we need to basically work together. And I'm really happy that we had this wide range of panel members today who come from a variety of backgrounds and faiths, because I think we have to learn from each other and work with each other and to make change. And also that we have to remember as faith people that there is divine justice, and that if you don't get this here, you will, inshallah, get this from Allah. Allah sees all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just a final thank you to all of our panelists, including Nazir and Shokat, who spoke very powerfully. All of you have spoken very powerfully today, and you shared your experience and your expertise, and I think it's been invaluable, so thank you so much. And as Saliha said, this is just the beginning. And a kind of final word from me is that we all have a role to play in this. So if you're aware of abuse of any kind, then really try and address that, report it if appropriate, where appropriate, and, really try and encourage organizations, people around you, to learn and to implement the policies and to understand and really educate yourselves and then try and educate others as well. Thank you very much.